Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm Steve Down. This is my guitar and my crazy shirt that my wife told me not to wear in this video. Thanks to all of you guys who followed along with the last series on Hot and Top by John Schofield. It was really fun diving deep into that, and I'm getting some really good feedback from people who are watching the video saying they're appreciating the deep dive into it. So I think I'm just going to keep going with that. And with that, this new series that we're starting on today is on Wes Montgomery's D Natural Blues. Before we get stuck into it, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who has supported the channel so far and what I'm doing here, whether that's liking, subscribing, commenting below, sending me emails, and special thanks to the patrons as well. Thanks to, I think it's Serge or Sergey, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it correctly or not, so I'm really sorry if I've mispronounced your name, but thanks so much for your support. And thanks to all the other patrons as well. I really appreciate it, and it does help me in continuing to make these lessons. And if you stumbled on this channel for the first time today because you were looking for some Wes stuff or how to play an octaves or what a jazz blues is, then if you want to support, then you can head over to www.patreon.com/extra guitar lessons. There's a link in the show notes below. And if you just want to kind of show your appreciation just as a one-off for this video, then there's a link to buy me a coffee below. And I drink tons of coffee. It kind of keeps me going when I'm doing all these videos and teaching online and everything. So I really appreciate all of those people who have bought me coffee so far. So I think that's all of the housekeeping. So on with the lesson. So Wes Montgomery is part of jazz heritage. He's a jazz guitar giant, an icon. It's famous for his right-hand thumb technique, which we'll get into a little bit later on, and for using octaves as a primary vehicle for expressing his creative ideas. One of his biggest albums, which has been put into the Library of Congress, is the Incredible Jazz Guitar. And the track that we're looking at today is taken off of that album. It's called, rather imaginatively, D Natural Blues. It's also kind of sometimes called Monterey Blues as well. I think it was named that possibly maybe because they just came up with it in the studio. Sometimes jazz musicians around that time, around that kind of golden era of jazz, or what I think is the golden era of jazz, that kind of like late 1950s to early 1960s kind of time, they improvised an awful lot of stuff in the studio, or they had vague ideas rather than fully thought out ideas, and so stuff would just get named off the cuff. So it could have just been one of those things, or it could just be that he genuinely wanted to call it D Natural Blues. Who knows? But the track itself comes off of that album. It's well worth listening to. It's a classic album, so do go onto iTunes or buy it from your local record store if it's open, or stream it on Spotify. Wherever, just make sure that you're listening to it because it's a classic jazz album and a classic jazz guitar album as well. So just a little bit of chat about the personnel on there. The pianist is Tommy Flanagan, famous for playing the solo on Giant Steps that's much talked about. And then it's the Heath brothers, Percy and Albert, who are in the rhythm section on bass and drums. The album's recorded on Riverside, classic album label from the late 50s, early 60s. Mingus is on that label. And I think it's worth noting Wes's gear on this. I did do some research into it. I mean, he's famous for using an L5 CES, which is cutaway electric Spanish, which is kind of similar to kind of like this kind of shape here, although mine's a thin line President, so it's quite thin. And I think his L5 was a lot thicker. But he's also famous for using L7s, and it's rumoured that he used the ES175 on this record, and that Kenny Burrell gave it to him to use on the record. I mean, a lot of this stuff is kind of like, some of it's, you know, mythology and that kind of thing. So, you know, jazz is kind of steeped in that. So we have to take that stuff with a pinch of salt. But it was probably one of those 3 guitars that he was using. By the mid 60s, Gibson had taken notice of him, and you know, he had his own guitars made for him. Yeah, pinch of salt, but generally it's that kind of Gibson archtop kind of, you know, jazz box kind of sound. Amp wise, I'm pretty sure that he's using a super reverb on there. It could be a twin reverb. Again, there's no kind of specifics about what he used on there, but it's probably, you know, it's a Fendery type sound that is on there. So if you're setting up your sound for it, I would go for that kind of, you know, really kind of immediate kind of Fendery type sound for your amplifier. The guitar wise, if you've got an arch top, then, you know, it's gonna be great for playing this stuff. You want to make sure that you're not rolling off the tone too much. I made that mistake earlier on in my journey with the guitar, that I thought, you know, rolling off an arch top, you know, would create that kind of, you know, more of that kind of sound, and it kind of muffles it. So if you've got an arch top, or you've got something with humbuckers, do make sure that you've got a certain clarity to it. So just balance that tone on your guitar to kind of make sure that you've got the clarity coming through. If you've got a single coil guitar, it's still possible, single coil pickup setup, then, you know, just select the net pickup and do roll the tone off on that one, so that you've got a bit more of the mid kind of EQs coming through and the low frequencies coming through. But again, don't make it sound muffly. Make sure that you've got a clarity in your tone that you can hear that. The other thing that, you know, obviously Wes is using is, you know, he does use flat wound strings. I'm using chrome flat wounds on here. You don't have to have them, but a heavier gauge string would, you know, go a long way to making that kind of a bit more of that sound. The gauge strings that he's supposed to have used was 14s. It was fairly heavy. I mean, on here I'm using 12s, so I don't think I could probably manage much more with my fingers. I think it would probably tear my fingers to shreds. But yeah, he used 14s on his, supposedly. So all of those things, you don't have to do all of them to create this kind of sound. Remember that we're not trying to mimic Wes Montgomery. In these lessons, we're trying to understand what he did in the solo, so that we can use those same techniques for navigating a jazz blues ourselves. So first thing we're going to take a look at 4 areas today. We're going to take a look at technique, the octave technique, the structure. We're going to take a look at the vocabulary that he's using, and we're going to take a look at this kind of really tricky, kind of slippery, slidey thing that he does with his octaves as well. So let's get started with taking a look at octaves. So, octaves. Wes Montgomery is famous for using octaves. It does create more of an immediate sound for the melody, especially when you're playing something like a guitar, where if you've got piano and double bass and drums, your lead melody line could get lost. So playing an octave is much more immediate, it stands out, and it's also got a bit more body to it than just... So an octave is a good thing for trying to stand out a little bit more if you're playing a solo or a melody, and you want to kind of just rise above the rest of the band when you're playing jazz. I often play melodies, standards in octaves. So yeah, octaves are a good thing. The technique of playing an octave, there's a couple of different ways that you can play it. So the way that it's laid out on the guitar, the 2 most used ways of doing it is between the 6th string and the 4th string, you'll have your octave. And then also between the 5th string and the 3rd string. And then going on into the upper strings, here you've got, instead of having 2 strings and 2 frets apart like the last 2, you've got 2 strings and 3 frets apart. So you have to kind of bring your 4th finger in if you're not already using it. I use my 4th finger for the lower ones as well. And then the top 2 strings, the top strings as well, the 3rd string and the 1st string, also 2 strings and 3 frets apart. So with that, you know, with octaves, it presents a bit of a challenge with dampening. We need to dampen the strings. So this is where your 4th finger and your 1st finger come into play. So you kind of make them a bit lazy, and rather than arching them out of the off the fretboard, you're laying them down, and so they're touching the strings beneath. So my 1st finger is laying on top of that 5th string, muting it, and then also on the third, on the second, and on the first. My fourth finger will come into play a little bit later on with the upper octaves, but here it's just my first finger doing all the dampening. So I can strum across all of the strings and I won't hear any opens. You can do it with the next one down as well, same thing. Using that first finger to dampen. When we get to here, I start to use the fourth finger to dampen the first string. So, and then I'm using my first finger to dampen some stuff as well. And then the same on the next one, my first finger is doing the dampening of this one. But if you notice, to dampen the upper ones, I'm using my second finger on these two shapes. So my second finger kind of sits, goes in between the two, make sure that it doesn't mute this string, the fourth string, but it does mute the bottom two strings here. And then that means that if I do, I'm not really aiming for those, but if I do happen to catch them, then it's going to mute them. So with your right hand, with your thumb, the thumb technique, you're literally just brushing it over the top of the string. You're not digging in, you're just brushing it over the top of the strings. I quite like to sit my fingers on the body of the guitar here. You may well like to just have your hand free. At faster pace, I am kind of like have my fingers free, but sometimes just to kind of have a little bit more accuracy, I sit on the guitar there. So here's a little exercise just for getting started with octaves, just going up the first three notes of the D major scale, so D, E, and F sharp. So take a look at this and just practice this with a metronome at your own pace until you get used to playing octaves. And then here is a bit more of a lick. So this is kind of like a kind of variation on a famous jazz lick. So you're going between the tonic and then sliding into the major third, and then the fourth, fifth, and then sliding back into that major third and back to the tonic. So here it is up close. So let's talk about structure. This piece is a jazz blues. So what is a jazz blues? Let's start by taking a look at a 12-bar blues. This is the structure of a 12-bar blues. So as you can see, it's made up of three chords, the 1, the 4, and the 5. I'm going to assume that you know that terminology. In this particular instance, it's the chords of D7, G7, and A7, because we're looking at a major blues. So those are the only chords that we've got. And this is your classic blues. So the next stage on from a standard 12-bar blues, is to add in a 2-5-1 in the last 4 bars. So with the jazz blues, the differences between a standard blues and a jazz blues generally happen in the last 4 bars or so. So this variation has a 2-5-1 in the last 4 bars. So in this case, in D, we've got E minor 7, A7, and then D, and then we'll go back to A7 again, back to your 5 chord again to turn you around to go back to the beginning. The other thing to note in this as well is that we've got what's called a quick change in the first 4 bars. So going between D7 to G7 and then back to D7 again. Rather than staying on the D7 for the first 4 bars like we did in the old 12 bar, we're now doing a quick change to the 4 chord and then back to the 1 chord again, and that happens in the first 2 bars, going on into the 3rd and 4th bar. So let's move on to a proper jazz blues. So building on what we had last time, so here we're going to add a secondary dominant to the 2 chord in bar 9, and we're also going to add a turnaround to the end. So we've added a secondary dominant in bar 8 as a dominant towards the 2 chord, which is in bar 9. So what's a secondary dominant chord? A secondary dominant chord is a dominant chord that resolves anywhere other than the tonic, or you could see it as a dominant 7th chord that's built on anything other than the 5th degree of the scale. So in this case, the 5th degree of the scale is going to be A, so it's a dominant chord that is not built on that. Obviously, as you'll know from your major scales and making chords from the degrees of the major scale, there's only one dominant chord in there. So what we're doing is we're creating a dominant chord. So that could be, in the case of D, it could be creating an E7, an F sharp 7, a G7, a B7, or a C sharp 7. Remember, we already have the A7 as our dominant chord. So a secondary dominant is anything other than the dominant chord built on the 5th degree of the scale. So in this case, we're moving towards the 2 chord in bar 9, which is E minor or E minor 7. So a secondary dominant going towards that would be B7, because the 5th degree of E is B. And what we've done is we've taken the 6th chord from the key of D and we've made it into a dominant chord, hence secondary dominant. So our chord sequence at the end now is in bar 8 a B7 rather than staying on that D, and then we move towards the 2, which is the E minor, then we go to the 5, the A7, and then back to the D. Now the last 2 bars, bars 11 and 12, this is where we have a turnaround. So the turnaround here is 1, 6, 2, 5. So D7, B7, so that's secondary dominant again, E minor 7, A7, and then you're taking you back to bar 1, again the D7. So in Wes's version of the jazz blues, he actually uses for his dominant, for his secondary dominant, he's not actually playing it as a dominant. This is where he's changed it. He's actually playing it as a minor. So he's playing a 6 on there. He's not adhering to the jazz blues staple of playing that as a secondary dominant. He's playing it as a minor, so he's playing it as a 6 chord. Okay, that's the way that he's seeing it. But he does approach it with, as if he's trying to kind of have that 2-5-1 mentality. So he's approaching it with the 3 chord. So he's doing a 3, 6, and then to the 2 of the E minor 7 there. So it's as if he's trying to kind of allude to that 2-5-1, the F sharp, B, and E. So it's as if he's trying to do that, but he's using 3, 6, 2, and then 5, and then 1. So that's what Wes's structure is for D natural blues. Now we can get on to the vocabulary that he uses for this melody line that he's playing. So let's talk about the vocabulary. So in the first 4 bars of this, we've got the so there's a lot going on there. Vocabulary wise, what he is using is a mixture of minor blues scale, so the D minor blues scale, which is this in octaves. He's also using the D7 and the G7 arpeggios as vocabulary. Now, you can argue that a lot of those notes from the minor blues scale, those notes from G7 are all contained within the minor blues scale, and yes, they are. But it's good to be aware of what they are in the arpeggio, as Wes would have been, because of the fact that we want to make sure that we're highlighting the chord tones. So if we look at bar 2, the G, 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 D, F, those 3 notes are really important within the G7 chord. So he's spelling out that G7 chord, which is in the underlying harmony. So it's really good to be aware of those arpeggios. So let's take a look at those arpeggios. And then in the next 2 bars, the D7, he's using... That is all minor pentatonic. And then... So we'll take a look at slides and stuff in a second. But essentially what he's doing there is he's bringing in, to really spell out that D7, the major third. So he's sliding from the minor third to the major third. And he's using the blue note as well. So it's really important to make sure that you've got your D7 and your G7 arpeggios sorted out in octaves, and also your minor blues scale. And again, when he then moves to the G7 in bar 5, so again, he's using all those notes from the G7 arpeggio, and then there. So there, he's staying around the kind of the D minor-y area. He's not really he's not really pinpointing exactly what's going on with the harmony, and he doesn't reference the F sharp minor too much. He plays an F sharp, so over the top of it, but to me, he's still spelling out D, so he's kind of ignoring that 2 going to the secondary dominant. But when he does get to the secondary dominant, so in bar 8, he's spelling out that B minor that's in the score. Remember, he's going F minor to B minor and then to E minor 7 after that. So he's spelling out that B minor there in an arpeggio. So it's useful to know your B minor arpeggio as well. For the final 4 bars, what he's doing there, a lot of what he's playing is blues vocabulary. So he's really going the C sharp to D there, superimposing that 5-1 C sharp from the A to the D. But a lot of it is blues vocabulary. There's not much else other than blues vocabulary that's in there. And then it's running down the blues scale. So at the very end there, you don't have to reference all of those chords. So that's, you know, what I was saying at the very beginning of this, making sure that you know the overall sound of it, because you don't have to reference every single chord that is in here. You don't have to be referencing the E minor and then going to the A7 and then the D. You don't have to be doing that. You can just use blues vocabulary. At the end of it. So the final thing is slides. So he's got all of these really slidey bits. That's a really tricky bit that he plays there. So you might have to slow that down. And it's about with your with your left hand, it's about making sure that you've got that shape locked in so you can move it around. So it's not, don't be too tense in your left hand or left arm, but you want to have that shape so that you can move it around without your fingers kind of crumbling and going to jelly. So that's going to be about you going up the fret using that exercise that we did at the beginning with the octaves to make sure that you can keep the same shape, and then also with that other lick try making sure that you can move between the two shapes, the 2 fretted shape and the 3 fretted shape of the octaves, and making sure that you can do that comfortably and eloquently. So one of the things that he does is he slides into the major third, and he also slides into the blue note as well, and he does that as well. He slides up and back down in 1 pick stroke or 1 thumb stroke. He also slides up into the minor third at the top. I love that bit. That bit's really, really cool. So if you can make sure you nail that, that's going to go a long way to you being able to nail the melody. So here's a little exercise for practicing doing some slides. So it's basically just the dominant 7th arpeggio, and all you're doing is sliding into the major third, and then from a tone down from the 5th, you're sliding into the 5th, and then sliding from a semitone underneath into the 7th, and then sliding from a tone underneath the octave into the octave itself. So here is the exercise, and practice that. So what are our takeaways from this? So the first one is that octave technique in the left hand, and then your thumb technique in the right hand, or vice versa if you're a left-handed guitarist. Making sure that you're dampening properly, that you've got the correct spacing with the correct fingering, and that you're using your thumb across the strings, lightly across the strings, not really heavily. The second thing is the structure, making sure that you understand the overall structure of a jazz blues and that you know how it works, what a jazz blues is, how it relates to a 12-bar blues, and you understand how it sounds as well. Make sure that you're playing through what Wes is doing. And then after that, it's vocabulary, knowing what vocabulary Wes is using, what language he's using, which is very much blues scale, but he's also aware of those arpeggios, and he's referencing those chord tones as they pass when he feels like it and where appropriate. And then the final thing is those slides. So as we talked about, making sure that you can slide into the major third and slide into the blue note and back to the 4th of the scale. So making sure that you can do that. So thanks so much if you got to the end of this and you've watched all the way through. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel if you want to see more. And you want to learn more about this. Next week we're going to be looking at the first chorus of the solo. And if you want to get all of the chord and scale packs, the exercises, the full transcription to the piece, and also some access to some extras as well, then Patreon is the place to go to do that, and that is www.patreon.com/extraguitarlessons, and that's up on the screen now. So apart from that, have a great week. And I'll see you next Saturday evening or Sunday morning on here. Have a great week of practice. Take care. Bye.